An old man with one eye walks alone through the frozen north. He has seen the end of the world. He knows exactly how he will die. And he keeps walking. Welcome to Shadow Folklore. Today, Odin the wind comes first. It always does in the north, cutting across the black water, bending the pines, shaking loose the last leaves from the ash trees that stand sentinel along the fjord. The sky is the color of iron. The mountains rise like broken teeth against it. There is no birdsong here, only the wind and the sound it makes when it moves through stone. In the distance, a figure walks. He wears a gray cloak that moves like smoke. A wide-brimmed hat shadows his face. He carries a staff, long and dark, carved with marks no one living can read. His stride is neither hurried nor slow. He does not stop to rest. He does not call out. He simply moves through the world as though he has always been moving through it, and will be moving through it long after the world itself has burned. He has one eye. The socket where the other should be is not empty. It is deliberate. A wound that was chosen, a price that was paid. And when he looks at you with that single eye, grey as winter water, you understand. He has seen things you cannot imagine. And the knowledge he carries is not comfort, it is weight. This is Finn, the Allfather, the Wanderer, the hanged god, the Lord of the slain. He is not the god of thunder or the hearth or the harvest. He is the god of knowledge, and he paid for it in pain. The people who worshipped him called themselves by many names across the centuries, but history has gathered them under one, the Norse. They were the seafaring communities of Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and the settlements they planted across the North Atlantic from Iceland to the Orkney Islands. From the coasts of Ireland to the river routes of Rus, they spoke Old Norse, a language that descended from Proto-Germanic and would later splinter into the modern Scandinavian tongues. Their world was one of fjords and forests, long winters and short summers, a landscape where survival required both ferocity and cunning. The period we now call the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, from the raid on Lindisfarne to the Battle of Stamford Bridge, marks the height of Norse expansion and the era when Fenton's cult reached its greatest influence. But the roots go deeper. The Germanic tribes of the migration period, centuries earlier, already honored a god called Fedenas in Proto-Germanic, a figure associated with fury, ecstasy, and the dead. The Romans, encountering these tribes along the Rhine and Danube, identified him with their own Mercury, a god of travelers, tricksters, and psychopomps. The comparison was apt, but incomplete. Fëanor was never so benign. The Norse cosmos was not a single world, but 9, all bound together by Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash that stood at the center of all things. Its roots reached down into the wells of fate and memory. Its branches held up the sky. On its limbs lived gods and giants, men and elves, the dead and the unborn. Feia, the realm of the Facer gods, sat high among the branches. Feia, the middle realm of humans, was encircled by an ocean in which the great serpent Mungandra lay coiled. Hell, the land of the dead, was deep below, cold and silent, and beyond all of it, at the edges, was Fey, the outyard, the wild places where giants and monsters made their homes. Fëanor ruled in Feia, but he was not content to stay there. He wandered the 9 worlds constantly, always asking questions. His hall was called Valfell, the Hall of the Slain, and there he gathered the bravest warriors who died in battle, the Einherjar training them for the war to come. But Valfell was not a paradise, it was a barracks, because Fëanor knew the future. He had seen Ragnar Fyke, the twilight of the gods, the day when the forces of chaos would break their chains, when fire and flood would devour the world, and when he himself would be swallowed whole by the wolf Fenrir. In the Norse worldview, fate was not something to be avoided. The Norns, 3 women who sat beside the well of Urfe beneath Yggdrasil wove the threads of every life, God and man alike. What they wove could not be unwoven. Even Fein, who had drunk from the well of wisdom, who had learned the runes, who sent his ravens Hugin and Munin thought and memory to spy on all creation, could not escape his fate. He could only prepare for it. This is what made Fein different from other sky fathers, other king, gods in other pantheons, Zeus on Olympus, Indra in the Vedic heavens, even Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple. These were gods of order. Gods who ruled from thrones and commanded obedience. Folklore ruled. Yes, he was called Folklore, the Allfather, but his power did not come from sovereignty. It came from suffering. He was a god who had sacrificed himself to himself, who had torn out his own eye for a drink of water, who had bled on a tree to learn the secret names of things. He was a god who knew that all victories were temporary, that all thrones would burn, and that knowledge, not strength, was the only thing worth dying for. In the Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems preserved in a 13th century Icelandic manuscript, known as the Codex Regius, Fen is described as many, named. Gr Feminism, Fe, Lel, one of the Eddic poems, lists over 50 of his Haiti, his poetic epithets. Yi, the terrible one, H. Fair, the high one, B. Fevoka, the evil, Gagnar Fair, the advantage, counselor. Each name reveals a facet of his nature. He is not a simple god. He is a god of masks. Physically, he is depicted as an old man, grey, bearded, tall, and gaunt. He wears a wide-brimmed hat or a hood to shadow his missing eye. His cloak is blue or grey, the color of twilight and storm. He carries Gungnir, a spear forged by the dwarfs, which never misses its mark. When he rides Sleipnir, an 8-legged horse, born of Loki's shape-shifting trickery, the fastest steed in all the worlds, able to gallop across the sky, over the sea, and even into the underworld. On his shoulders sit 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin. Every morning, they fly out across the 9 worlds. Every evening, they return and whisper into his ears all that they have seen. In the poem, Gr Feminism, Fen says, Hugin and Munin fly each day over the wide world. I fear for Hugin, that he come not back. Yet more, I fear for Munin. He fears for thought, yes, but because Finn understands that knowledge without memory is meaningless, and memory, unlike thought, can be lost. At his feet lie 2 wolves, Jerry and Freki, whose names both mean the greedy one. In Valfell, Fein gives them all the meat set before him, for he himself consumes nothing but wine. He is a god of hunger, not for food, but for wisdom, for secrets, for the hidden structures that hold the world together. In the Prose Edda, written by the Icelandic scholar and poet Snorri Sturluson around 1220, Fein is presented as the chief of the Facer, the foremost of the gods who made a pact with the Vanir, another tribe of deities associated with fertility and prosperity. But even in Snorri's more orderly retelling, Fein is unpredictable. He is a god who breaks oaths when it suits him, who stirs up wars between kings for his own purposes, who seduces mortal women and abandons them, who grants victory in battle one day and betrays his champions the next. He is not a god of justice. He is a god of knowledge, and knowledge does not care about fairness. In visual art from the Viking Age, on runestones, in wood carvings, on the Gotlandic picture stones from the island of Gotland, Fein appears in fragmentary images, a one-eyed figure on horseback, a man hanging from a tree, a warrior welcoming the dead. The imagery is spare, suggestive rather than explicit. The Norse did not build monumental temples to rival the Parthenon or the pyramids of Egypt. Their sacred sites were often natural, groves of trees, springs, rock outcroppings. The divine was not distant. It was immediate, imminent, woven into the landscape. Over time, Fein's image evolved. In the migration period before the Viking Age, He may have been primarily a god of the war band, the frenzied ecstasy of battle, the fear, the fury or inspiration that seizes a warrior or poet and lifts them beyond themselves. But by the Viking Age, he had become something more, a god of kings and poets, of skalds and rune masters, of those who sought power not through brute strength, but through cunning, through words, through the ability to see what others could not. They are stories of cost. The first and most famous is the sacrifice of his eye. In the poem Vifalisfe, the Vifilelva, a seeress raised from the dead to speak prophecy, recounts the beginning of things. Beneath Yggdrasil, the world tree, there are three great wells. One is Urfeabruna, the well of fate, where the Norns weave destiny. Another is Hvirgelmir, the roaring cauldron from which all rivers flow. And the third is Emfemisbruna, the well of Emfemir. Mir was a figure of immense wisdom, possibly one of the Facer, possibly something older. His well was filled with the water of knowledge, not mere facts, but deep understanding, the kind that lets you see the threads connecting all things, past and future, cause and consequence. To drink from it was to know the structure of the cosmos itself. In came to the well. Emfemir guarded it, and Emfemir demanded a price. Fane did not hesitate. He drew a knife, or perhaps he used his hands, or perhaps the act was more ritual than literal. A symbolic wounding that echoed across the 9 worlds. He plucked out his right eye, the one that saw the surface of things, and cast it into the well. The water accepted it, and Emfemir gave him a single drink. What did Finn see in that moment? The poems do not say, not exactly. But after he drank, he was never the same. He became the god who knows. The god who sees not just what is, the god who understands that the world is not eternal, that even the gods will die, that Ragnar fake is not a possibility but a certainty. And he could do nothing to stop it later. During the war between the Facer and the Vanir, Emfemir himself was killed. His head cut off and sent to Fane as a grim trophy, but Finn did not bury it. He took the head, treated it with herbs and magic, and preserved it. And in the darkest times, he would speak to Emferd's head, and the head would speak back, offering counsel that no living being could give. Even in death, Emfern's wisdom endured. Even in death, Fern sought knowledge. The second great sacrifice is recounted in Hvaem, Fael, the sayings of the High One, a poem in the Poetic Edda. It is told in Faen's own voice, a first-person account of the ordeal that won him the runes. The runes were not merely an alphabet, they were symbols of power, each one a key to a different aspect of reality: victory, protection, healing, binding, cursing, love, death. To know the runes was to wield the fundamental forces of the universe, but they were not freely given. They had to be earned. In says, I know that I hung on a wind-rocked tree 9 whole nights, pierced by a spear, and given to Finn, myself to myself, on that tree of which no man knows from what root it rises. He hung himself from Yggdrasil. He pierced himself with his own spear, Gungnir, a deliberate echo of the deaths suffered by warriors dedicated to him. For 9 days and 9 nights, he hung there. No food, no water, no comfort. The wind tore at him. The cold bit into him. He stared down into the void, into the space between the worlds, and he waited. He was dying. He was not dying. He was becoming something else. And then, at the edge of death, he saw them, the runes, glowing at the base of the tree. He reached down, and they came to him. He screamed. The tree shook, and when he fell, he knew their names. He knew their shapes. He knew how to cut. This is the mystery at the heart of Faen's cult. He is a god who sacrificed himself to himself. He was both the priest and the offering, the seeker and the prize. In later Christian commentaries, this act was sometimes compared to the crucifixion of Christ, another god who hung from a tree, another god who died and returned. But the comparison is imperfect. Christ died for humanity's sins. Féin died for knowledge. Christ promised salvation. Féin promised nothing. There are other myths. Finn seduced Gunnulfé, a giantess, to steal the mead of poetry, a magical drink that granted the gift of verse to anyone who tasted it. He shape-shifted into an eagle to escape, carrying the mead in his belly, and regurgitated it into a vessel in Feisgar. Some of it spilled, landing on Mythology. And this is why some poets are mediocre. They got only the dregs. True poets, true skalds, drink what Phaeton himself brought back. In fathered many sons, Fair, the thunderer, by the earth goddess Fé, Bolger, the shining god, by his wife Frigg, Ve, the silent avenger, by the giantess Fé, and others, demigods and heroes scattered across the 9 worlds. But his relationship with his children is complicated. He loves them, perhaps, but love does not stop him from using them. When Bolger, the most beloved of all the gods, begins to have nightmares of his own death, Finn rides to the underworld to consult a dead seeress. She confirms it, Balder will die, and Féin, who could intervene, who could warn, who could stop it, does nothing, because Balder's death is part of the pattern. It is one more thread in the weaving that leads to Ragnar Fake and Ragnar Fake itself. The myths are clear about what will happen. The wolf Fenrir, whom the gods bound with a magical chain because they feared his strength, will break free. Loki, the trickster, the blood, brother of Fenn, will lead the giants and the dead in rebellion against the gods. The Mythology serpent will rise from the ocean. The fire giant Surtur will march from the south with a flaming sword. The Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, will shatter. And on the plain of Yggdrasil, the gods will make their final stand. Féin will lead the Einherjar into battle. He will fight Fenrir, and Fenrir will swallow him whole. In knows this. He has known it since he drank from Mimir's well. He knows that his death is not a surprise or a betrayal. It is written, and yet he does not despair. He does not surrender. He gathers warriors. He prepares. He fights. Because that is what Finn is. A god who knows the future and cannot change it, but refuses to look away. The Norse people worshipped Finn in ways that were as varied as the lands they inhabited. Unlike the monumental temple complexes of Rome or Egypt, Norse religious practice was decentralized, fluid, and tied closely to the local landscape and the needs of the community. But certain patterns emerge from the sagas, the Eddas, and the archaeological record. The most famous site associated with Féin is the Great Temple at Uppsala, in what is now Sweden. Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler writing around 1075, described it in his Gesta Hamburgensis, Ecclesiae Pontificum, the deeds of the bishops of Hamburg. He wrote that the temple was made entirely of gold, that it housed statues of 3 gods, Féin, Fair, and Freyr, and that every 9 years a great festival was held there. 9 days, 9 sacrifices, their bodies swung in the wind. Adam, a Christian, was horrified. But for the Norse, this was a reenactment of Finn's own sacrifice on Yggdrasil. How much of Adam's account is accurate is debated among scholars. He was writing second-hand, from the testimony of Christian converts who may have exaggerated for effect, or to please their new clergy. Archaeological excavations at Gamla Uppsala, Old Uppsala, have found evidence of large feasting halls, burial mounds for kings, and ritual activity, but no temple of gold. What is clear is that Uppsala was a center of power, a place where kings were made and gods were honored, and that Féin's presence loomed large there. Elsewhere, worship was more intimate. The sagas describe individuals making offerings to Féin before battle, carving his image into the prow of a longship, or invoking his name before reciting poetry. Warriors would dedicate their enemies to him by casting a spear over the opposing army and shouting, Fain, Fei, Fei, Allah. Fein owns you all. This was not a prayer for mercy. It was a promise of death. Fein's sacrifices were distinct from those offered to other gods. Freya received offerings of goats and grain, symbols of strength and sustenance. Freya received offerings for fertility, for the harvest, for peace. But Fein demanded blood. He was the god of the gallows, the god of the hanged man, the god who presided over the Bielfate, the ritual slaughter that bound the community to the divine. The word Bielfite itself comes from a root meaning to strengthen or to sacrifice. It involved the killing of animals, horses, cattle, sometimes pigs or dogs, and the sprinkling of their blood on altars, on sacred objects, and on the people themselves. The meat was then cooked and shared in a communal feast. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a sacrament, a way of joining the human and the divine, of feeding the gods, so that the gods, in turn, would sustain the world. Human sacrifice is attested in the historical record, though it was likely rare and reserved for moments of extreme crisis or significance. In the Ynglinga saga, Snorri Sturluson describes how King Arn of Sweden, desperate to extend his life, sacrificed 9 of his sons to Fain over the course of many years, offering one son each time death approached. The people eventually stopped him, but the story reflects a belief that Fein accepted human life as payment, not because he was cruel, but because life was the most valuable thing a human could give. The priesthood, such as it was not a separate caste. In Norse society, the roles of chieftain, king, and priest often overlapped. A jarl or king might lead the Bielfate, speaking the words, spilling the blood, interpreting the omens. There were also figures called Gofei, plural Gofei, local leaders, who maintained sacred sites and presided over rituals. Women, too, could hold religious authority. The Vifelva, or Ceres, was a practitioner of Sesi-Fe, a form of magic associated with prophecy, trance, and communication with the dead. And Seye-Fe, intriguingly, was said to have been taught to the gods by the Vanir goddess Freyja, and practiced by Fein himself, despite the fact that it was considered unmanly, urgy, for a man to do so. Fein did not care about propriety. He cared about power. Ritually, his followers sought to emulate him. The Berserkir, the Bear Shirts, warriors who fought in a trance, like Fury, were said to be Fekin's men, possessed by the same Fekir that filled the god himself. They wore animal skins, howled like beasts, and were said to be immune to pain in battle. Whether this was a literal phenomenon, perhaps induced by ritual intoxication, psychoactive plants, or extreme psychological conditioning, or a literary exaggeration is uncertain, but the cultural memory was clear. There were men who served Fein by becoming something more and less than human. The dead, too, belonged to him. Half of those who died in battle went to Valfil, chosen by the Valkyrja, Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, warrior, woman who rode over battlefields and claimed souls for Fenton. The other half went to Freyja's hall, but Valfil was Fein's domain, and those who entered became his Einherjar, feasting and fighting every day in preparation for Ragnarfake. It was not a peaceful afterlife. It was eternal training for a war everyone knew they would lose. The Norse world did not exist in isolation. From the 8th century onward, Norse traders, raiders, and settlers came into contact with Christian Europe, the Islamic caliphates, the Byzantine Empire, and the peoples of the eastern forests and steppes. And as they did, the figure of Fenton, already strange and unsettling to his own worshippers, became something even more contested. Christian missionaries saw in Finn a demon. In the 9th and 10th centuries, as conversion efforts intensified in Scandinavia, clerics like Ansgar of Bremen preached that the old gods were not gods at all, but devils who deceived humanity. Finn, with his shape shifting, his necromancy, his association with the gallows and the dead, was an easy target. He was reframed as a servant of Satan, a false idol leading souls to damnation. But the Norse themselves did not convert easily. Kings like Håkon the Good in Norway and Fra Tryggvason later tried to impose Christianity by force, destroying temples, executing resistors, and banning BL fates. Fra, in particular, was ruthless. The sagas describe him burning men alive, drowning them, or exiling them to remote islands. And yet, even after conversion, the old ways persisted in folklore, in place names, in the days of the week. Wednesday, Woden's Day, named for Phaeton's Anglo-Saxon form, W. Faden. Snorri Sturluson, writing his Prose Edda in the early 13th century, nearly 2 centuries after Iceland's official conversion, attempted a different approach. He presented the gods as euhemerized heroes, ancient kings and warriors who had been deified over time. Fenn, in Snorri's telling, was a chieftain from Asia, a region Snorri calls Faesaland, confusing it with Faesa, the gods who migrated north, conquered Scandinavia through cunning and magic, and was worshipped as a god after his death. This rationalization allowed Snorri to preserve the myths while making them palatable to a Christian audience. It also flattened them, stripped them of their numinous power. The Icelandic scholar Magnan Fese Lafsson, working in the 17th century, went further, interpreting the myths as allegories of natural forces or moral lessons. Finn's one eye became the sun, with the other lost in the darkness of ignorance. His ravens became the mind's faculties. Valfale became a metaphor for the warrior aristocracy. This allegorical approach would dominate European scholarship for centuries. In the 19th century, as Romanticism swept through Europe, Finn was reimagined again, this time as a symbol of national identity. German scholars and poets, seeking the roots of folk culture, latched onto the Norse myths as a purer, more authentic alternative to the Greco. Richard Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen, 1876 recast Phaeton, as Wotan as a tragic, flawed patriarch, whose lust for power dooms the world. The operas were monumental, beautiful, and deeply problematic. They fed into an emerging narrative of Germanic superiority that would later be weaponized by the Nazis. By the 20th century, Fyn had become a site of ideological struggle. In Nazi Germany, the SS adopted Norse symbolism, including runes and references to Valhalla, as part of their pseudo-pagan mythology of blood and soil. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was fascinated by the occult and sought to construct a new religion that blended Norse myth, racial theory, and esoteric mysticism. The result was a grotesque distortion, one that had little to do with the actual beliefs or practices of the Viking Age. After the war, scholars worked to disentangle Norse religion from fascism. Hilda Ellis Davidson, E.O.G. Turville, Petter, in Myth and Religion of the North 1964, explored the tensions and contradictions within the sources, acknowledging that Fenn was not a straightforward hero, but a figure of deep moral ambiguity. Meanwhile, outside the academy, practitioners were beginning to reclaim the Norse gods as living religious figures. The emergence of Fai Satra, Fai in the 1970s, a modern revival of pre-Christian Norse religion, brought Faian back into active worship. Some Satra Fey groups embrace him as a god of wisdom and self-sacrifice. Others focus on Fair or Freyr, finding Faian too dangerous, too unpredictable, too willing to demand what his followers cannot give. And the shadow of white supremacy lingers. Some racist groups have adopted Norse symbols and claimed Fane as a god of their imagined Aryan past, forcing mainstream Fey organizations to publicly and repeatedly denounce such misappropriations. The modern rediscovery of Fen began not with theologians or mystics, but with antiquarians and philologists, men who dug into manuscripts and deciphered runes, who recognized that the Norse myths were not corruptions of Christianity, but something older, stranger, and more complete. The key breakthrough came in 1643, when Bishop Brynjolfur Sveinsson of Sk Feyholt Iceland, acquired a manuscript that would become known as the Codex Regius. It contained 29 poems in Old Norse, heroic and mythological, preserving stories that had been passed down orally for centuries before being written down in the 13th century. Among them were Veifolus, Fae, the prophecy of the Cirrus, H. Fam Fae, the sayings of the High One, and Giar Fainism Fae, the sayings of Giar Fainir, poems in which Faes speaks directly, revealing his nature, his sacrifices, his knowledge of the end. These poems, along with Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, became the foundation of modern Norse mythology scholarship, but for a long time they were treated as literary curiosities, not as living religious texts. It was not until the 20th century that scholars began to reconstruct what Norse paganism might actually have looked like in practice. Archaeologists uncovered ritual sites across Scandinavia. At Legra in Denmark, excavations revealed the remains of massive feasting halls dating to the 6th and 7th centuries, places where kings and warriors gathered to eat, drink, and honor the gods. At Trelleborg and Furkat in Denmark, and at Birka in Sweden, grave goods included weapons, jewelry, and sometimes human and animal remains arranged in ways that suggest ritual significance. In 1904, at Oseberg in Norway, a ship burial was unearthed containing the remains of 2 women, a wealth of grave goods, and a ship so beautifully preserved that it is now one of the great treasures of the Viking Age. The ship's prow was carved with intricate designs. The women, possibly a queen and her servant, or perhaps a priestess and her attendant, were buried with sleds, textiles, and tools for a journey into the next world. The burial reflects the Norse belief that death was not an ending but a transition, and that the dead needed provisions. Runestones, too, provided clues across Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Thousands of stones were carved with runic inscriptions, many of them memorials to the dead. Some invoke Freyr, asking for his protection. Others mention Fein obliquely, calling the deceased a warrior of Fein, or describing him as going to Valhalla. The runes themselves were believed to carry power. The inscription was not just a message, but a spell, a way of binding the dead to memory and to the gods. In the modern era, Fae Satra Fae and other Norse reconstructionist movements have attempted to revive these practices. The Fae Satra Fae are Feilagi, Fae, founded in Iceland in 1972, is the oldest and largest such organization. Its members practice Bel Fete and Sumbel, a ritual toasting ceremony, celebrate the old festivals, and Yule, and honor the gods through poetry and offerings. What remains is reconstruction, interpretation, a best-guess attempt to honor the past without pretending it can be fully recovered. And that reconstruction is fraught with challenges. How do you worship a god like Fern in a world that no longer believes in fate as an inescapable force? How do you make sense of his demand for sacrifice in a culture that values safety, consent, and individual autonomy? Some practitioners embrace Finn as a god of intellectual pursuit, a patron of scholars and seekers. Others see him as a god of the marginalized, the wanderer, the one who breaks rules and defies expectations. Still, others avoid him entirely, wary of his demands and his unpredictability. The academic study of Norse religion has also evolved. Scholars like Jaro Steinsland, Neil Price, and John Lindo have explored the social and political dimensions of the myths, showing how they reflected and reinforced power structures in Viking Age society. Price's The Viking Way, 2002 delves into Say, Fair and other forms of Norse magic, connecting them to shamanistic practices among the Esfami and other circumpolar peoples. Steinsland's work emphasizes the role of women in Norse religion, challenging older narratives that painted it as a purely masculine warrior cult. And slowly, a more nuanced picture has emerged. Norse religion was not monolithic. It varied by region, by time period, by social class. It was influenced by contact with the Celts, the Slavs, the Finns, the Balts. It absorbed and adapted. Fëin himself may have started as a localized god of the war band, grown into a pan-Scandinavian figure, and then been reshaped again by the Skalds and Saga writers who preserved his stories. He is not a fixed figure. He is a process, a question that each generation answers differently. Fëin entered popular culture slowly, but once he arrived, he never left. The first major appearance came in Richard Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen, a cycle of 4 operas premiered between 1869 and 1876. Wagner's Wotan, the German form of Fëin's name, is a god tormented by his own ambition. He seeks to rule the cosmos through the power of a cursed ring, but every step he takes entangles him further in a web of betrayal, loss, and doom. In Die Walk Fëire, the second opera, Wotan must choose between enforcing his own laws and saving his daughter Br Fenhilde, the Valkyrie. He enforces the law, and in doing so, loses everything. Wagner's Wotan is not heroic. He is tragic, a god broken by his own need for control. The operas were controversial in their time. Too long, too strange. But they became central to the Western classical music canon, and they fixed an image of Fëin as a deeply flawed, almost Shakespearean figure. In literature, J.R.R. Tolkien, a philologist who spent years translating Old Norse texts, wove elements of Fëin into his legendarium. Gandalf, the Wandering Wizard in The Hobbit, 9/1837, and The Lord of the Rings, 9/1854-55, is explicitly modelled on Fëin, an old man in grey with a staff and a wide-brimmed hat who walks the world in secret, who manipulates events from behind the scenes, who sacrifices himself, falling into shadow in Moria, then returning transformed. Tolkien also borrowed Fëin's relationship with fate. In Middle-earth, as in the Norse cosmos, the future cannot be fully known or controlled, and even the wisest must act without certainty. In the mid-20th century, as comic books exploded in popularity, Marvel Comics introduced its own version of Fëin, first appearing in Journey into Mystery, number 85, 1962, created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Marvel's Odin is the father of Thor and the king of Asgard. But this Odin, the Marvel spelling drops the Norse Fae, is sanitized, made palatable for a mass audience. He is stern but benevolent, a wise father, king in the mold of Zeus or the Judeo-Christian god. He does not pluck out his eye on page. He does not hang from a tree. He does not manipulate his children into doomed quests. He is, in short, a completely different character who happens to share a name and a few surface details with the Norse god. This Marvel version became the dominant image of Fëin for millions of people worldwide, especially after the Marvel Cinematic Universe began. Anthony Hopkins portrayed Odin in Thor 2011, Thor: The Dark World 2013, and Thor: Ragnarok 2017. Hopkins brought gravitas to the role. It is a far cry from being swallowed by a wolf in video games. Fëin appears in numerous forms. God of War 2018 and God of War Ragnarok 2022 present him as the primary antagonist, a paranoid tyrant obsessed with preventing Ragnarok at any cost, willing to torture and manipulate even his own family to maintain control. This Odin, again, simplified spelling, is closer to the mythic figure in some ways, calculating, ruthless, willing to sacrifice anything for knowledge. But he is explicitly villainous, a figure the player is meant to oppose and ultimately defeat. The game ends with Odin's death, not at the jaws of Fenrir, but at the hands of the protagonist. It is a cathartic inversion of the myth. In Neil Gaiman's novel American Gods 2001, Fëin appears as Mr. Wednesday again. Woden's-day, a conman and grifter who recruits the protagonist, Shadow, into a war between the old gods and the new. Gaiman's Fëin is charming, dangerous, and utterly self-serving. He lies, he manipulates, he uses people, and in the end, his grand plan is revealed to be another sacrifice. Another elaborate con in which he himself is both the architect and the victim. Gaiman, who has also written a retelling of the Norse myths in Norse Mythology 2017, understands that Finn is not a hero. He is a god who will burn the world to learn its secrets. These portrayals, from Wagner to Marvel to Gaiman, reflect the same tension that runs through the original myths. Finn is fascinating because he is morally ambiguous. He is the god who seeks knowledge at any cost, who sacrifices others and himself, who knows the future but cannot escape it. He is not comforting, he is not safe, and that makes him difficult to adapt for mainstream audiences, who want their heroes clear and their villains obvious. What has been lost in many of these adaptations is the existential weight of Finn's knowledge. In the myths, he is not trying to stop Ragnar Frey. He knows he cannot. He is simply trying to face it with open eyes. That is a profoundly different story from the typical hero's journey, and it is one that popular culture has struggled to tell. In 2026, we live in a world obsessed with knowledge. We have access to more information than any previous generation in human history. We can search, stream, scroll, and learn anything in seconds. We know about climate collapse, political instability, the fragility of our systems, and we watch it unfold, unsure how to respond. Thorn is the god of that paralysis. He plucked out his eye to see the future, and the future was ruin. He learned the runes to master reality, and reality was already written. He gathered the bravest warriors to Valfell, knowing they would fall at Ragnar Frey. He did everything a god could do to prepare, to learn, to control, and none of it changed his fate. But he did it anyway. There is something unbearably modern in that. We too live in the shadow of an ending we can see. We know the ice caps are melting, the seas are rising, the systems that sustain us are breaking down. We know, and yet we cannot seem to change course. The difference is that Finn did not despair. He did not stop. He kept walking, kept learning, kept preparing. Not because he believed he could win, but because the alternative was surrender. Finn is not. He is a god of commitment in the face of hopelessness. He is also a god of cost. Every answer he found demanded a sacrifice. His eye, his body, 9 days on a tree. And in our age of instant answers and frictionless interfaces, we have forgotten that knowledge has weight. That wisdom is not the same as information. That to see clearly sometimes requires giving up something you cannot get back. He walked through the 9 worlds with one eye, asking questions no one else dared ask. He learned the names of things. He spoke with the dead. He prepared for a war he knew he could not win, and when the wolf came, he faced it. That is the paradox of Fane. He is the god who knows that. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.